WNN.
The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. Welcome to the CareGiver reality show with your hosts, David Levy and Paul Vadiato, who bring you more than a combined 25 years of practical experience, helping thousands of family caregivers, helping them find solutions to the challenges and frustrations presented by this important responsibility. So if you are in the position of caring for a spouse or a parent, a loved one who is no longer able to care for themselves, or if you know someone who is, this hour will be worth the listening. Now, let's tune in to today's edition of CareGiver Reality with your hosts, David Levy and Paul Vadiato.
Good evening, South Florida, America, and the world. It's the CareGiver Reality Hour. We're back, so it must be Tuesday at 5 o'clock. You're listening to us on CareGiverReality.com if you're watching us on WWNN 1470 AM for the listener in the South Florida area, iHeartRadio, anywhere in the world, AMP Squared or AMP2 TV, simultaneously with us. And if you got a question, it's 1-888-565-1470. We have a very special guest tonight because I didn't mention it last week, but June happens to be Alzheimer's and Brain Disease Month. We're not trying to overemphasize the fact, but it is. And so we have a very renowned neurologist who will be calling in. Not only is he a neurologist, but he's one of the principal investigators in a lot of the new drugs for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and some of the others. So it's going to be very interesting. And next week, we have a couple of the scientists from Scripps Research who will be giving you some advanced information about what they're working on. So if you want to know, you'll hear it here first. That's all I can say. Paul, how was your week?
Yeah, well, first of all, good evening, David, and good evening to our listeners, and thank you for joining us this evening. My week in caregiving, it was a relatively good week. I mean, we had a couple of down days, up and around, feeling a little bit better, and a little bit more positive mental attitude, which is a great relief for me. And for those of you out there who are spousal caregivers, you know, you got to take those good days and really bask in the sunshine of them, because sometimes they don't come around that often, and appreciate the moment.
Absolutely, and this has been a pretty good week for my spouse, and actually this morning I took her out and we did a little shopping, and it was good to see her walking around the sales counters. And so like you said, you got to take the good days when they come and take advantage of it, and there's nothing that a spouse, at least a wife, likes more than if she has an ounce of energy to go shopping.
Well, we've become mall walkers.
Okay.
So we're there early in the morning before the store is open. It's air conditioned. It's a safe place to go, and they have benches along the way. So it's a great place to get exercise. For those of you that have a mall convenient, excellent considering the weather and whatnot. Easy drive, in and out, an hour.
All right. And this week I was with my daughter for Father's Day on Sunday, and I found out that I became a grandfer.
A grandfer?
Right. That's a grandparent whose daughter has 2 new dogs. All right, and they are a combination of Maltese, Pekingese, and Chihuahua. All I can tell you is they're absolutely adorable. I'm a proud grandfather. One's male, one's female. The female is called Bella, and the male is called Zeus. Maybe a little bit more than these dogs are going to grow into in terms of the name, but they're absolutely just cute as heck. And tomorrow, one of my grandfatherly responsibilities after we finish the morning support group is I have to go on over to her house and take them out. So I'm being paper trained.
Well, good for you.
Right.
David, before you move on, last week I published a photo of our cat, Katie, and officially an emotional support animal. There also are therapy animals as well. And to our listeners out there who either on our website or on Facebook liked the picture and offered a few comments along the way, so much appreciated, and can't overestimate the importance of pets in terms of our loved ones and those that really need the help and support.
Right. Well, as I've said before, we have 4 at home. And they are constant companions to my wife, and I don't know how she would have gotten through some of the things she's gone through without their undying devotion and the fact that they snuggle up next to her and sleep when she sleeps.
And they help me as well.
Anyway, we'll move on because this is not the veterinarian hour.
Okay.
And a couple of things that you should be aware of. Number one, we're seeing a lot more information starting to come down about caregiving from a lot of very diverse sources. One of the great researchers in caregiving is a doctor, a PhD, by the name of Steve Zarrett. He's been around for a long time. From a more technical perspective, his Zarrett stress scale has been utilized for years in trying to assess not only stress in the caregiver, but stress in other psychological and clinical situations. This week, he was part of a major panel and a discussion on a paper that he gave. And then he was interviewed by the American Psychological Association strictly on caregiving. And the thing I appreciate, even though he has a very strong clinical background, he talks caregiving the way we do, from a very non-clinical perspective, notwithstanding his credentials. And one of the things that he was making mention of, and that we'll be bringing more information about, is caregiving in the workplace. This is such an overlooked subject. And I've been having discussions with organizations related to caregiving in the workplace because it is so difficult to be a family caregiver, an unpaid family caregiver, and still have the responsibility of being a caregiver while you're at work. Whether you're a mom with a special needs kid, whether or not you're a sister or a brother that are taking care of anybody, I'm talking now at least working age, that are still responsible for somebody at home, or whether you're somebody 45 to 65 in the workplace. And by the way, the retirement age, they announced it a couple months ago, but they repeated it today. The retirement age used to be 57 years old. It's now jumped to 62. And from the information that we're getting about the need to stay in the workplace and the desire to keep busy, but more importantly is the recognition that in an aging world, we're living longer. And many people did not plan to get to be 85 and 90 and still have assets and other things that we need to keep us going. And the promise of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, while I believe they will continue to be there, at least for the next significant decade, it doesn't give you more than a subsistence level and a safety net in terms of Medicaid. And Medicaid's getting tougher and tougher. Paul?
Well, I think you hit a very strong point. The financial implications of this longevity, particularly if there is illness along the way, most people are totally unprepared for. And I think starting with a good inventory of where they are now, and then looking at what that planning, what those numbers will do with proper planning, will go a long way. And coincidentally today, both my wife and I have long-term care insurance policies.
Right.
Notice of premium increased today, and that's just going to be the trend. Things are going to cost more. There's going to be less help from other sources, and we're going to have to rely more and more upon our own resources. And to reinforce what you said, it's going to be an aging workplace that are going to stay at the job longer.
Right. And the older that the workforce gets, I think we have to recognize as well, is that not only does an older workforce have its own individual issues of aging, illness, etc. But the likelihood of having a lot more spousal caregiving, or between 45 and 55, having a lot more son and daughter for parent going on. We've been looking at the numbers of our audience. Our audience is a solid 44 to 65. That's our demographic for you folks listening out there. And we're just about balanced even between male and female. And that doesn't surprise me, because over the last few years, more and more men have had to step up and be caregivers. And it's an issue, especially in the workplace, because caregiving has not been looked upon in the workplace as something that they want to see. And the reason is because if you're thinking about caregiving, you have issues that relate to what you're concerned about, and you're not giving the boss 100% of your time. So they look at it that way. It's a huge productivity loss. When you stop to think, if somebody's taking an hour or two or three once a week at whatever the rate is that they're paid, not only is that a direct monetary loss to the organization that you work for, but who else that works around you and with you is affected by the fact that you're distracted, or that you're dealing with other issues, or you're on the phone worried about Meals on Wheels. Is Dad feeling all right? Did he take his meds? And so more and more caregiving in the workplace has to have more effective solutions. We can't just work on flex time, telecommuting. You take a look at an organization that's got under 25 or 30 people, that's a real hands-on. I mean, suppose you worked in a grocery store, all right, just as a for instance. How do you telecommute? What does flex time really mean for you?
Does it help you?
All right. See, those are great buzzwords that human resources like to talk about, but is it really effective as being able to make caregivers safe and secure, that they can raise their hands in the workplace and take advantage maybe of a support group or something that is more personal? Because historically, what we've offered is what's called INR, information and referral. And if you don't know what you're asking for, it's very difficult to call up. All right? It's one thing when you have a legal plan and you say, get me a lawyer, at least I know why I'm calling. And when you call up and say, I'm having a hell of a day because I'm a caregiver, well, I can offer you this advice. We can get you a geriatric case manager, which is great, assuming you even need one or know what they are. And we can refer you to organizations in your area. I'm not talking about community-based resources, but we can tell you where all the nursing home, assisted living, et cetera, et cetera. That's assuming that you need that. And maybe some people will say I'm making a broad generalization. But I've been in this industry for 27 years, and I've watched it grow up. And in the early days, I had an effective call center for an insurance company where we handled nothing but caregiver issues. We didn't deal with the patient or the insured. We just dealt with the family. And I know how diverse those issues can be, and they really haven't changed over the years except to get more complicated, because the system is more complicated. And I think the next big push in the workplace is going to recognize the fact that caregivers are really embedded in there. 30-40% of the workforce today are caregivers.
And ironically, it's those caregivers that oftentimes are the wisdom warriors of the company. Those are the ones who are key people, hard to replace. And if the workplace is caregiver friendly, in other words, they've done education, they've offered some training, they've offered a place where they can go and get help at the workplace, it helps to attract more and better talent.
And retain it.
Retain that talent for a lot longer. And as what we see happening, there's the potential of litigations coming out as a result of people feeling discriminated against because of that caregiving.
Right, and these are issues that we're constantly going to see. We've seen it, but now it's reached a point where you have 30% or 35% of the workforce that's caregiving in one shape or form or another. You can no longer put it under the rug or say it's not happening or use 1990 solutions to 2014 problems. And I hear it every week. I listen to it in my support groups and people that call. And by the way, for employers out there, I want you to know that one of the things that Caregiver Reality on the consulting side does is we work with a workforce to help you do a better job of recognizing the caregiver and putting into place changes that will allow the caregiver to feel more comfortable in the workplace, keep up their productivity, because they do have alternatives to turn to than just flex time, telecommuting, or an HR employee assistance program. I'm not bashing any of those, but it's not enough when you see how much caregiving is going on and how complicated it's getting.
You need more tools in the toolbox.
Absolutely. And you need the recognition in the workforce. And I guarantee you that anytime you walk into the executive offices of a company, what they call the C-suite, the corporate suite, and you ask them, how many of you are caregiving? If they're over the age of 45, they're going to raise their hand, or they're going to say, I see it coming, or I know very well because 4 of my neighbors are going through this at the same time.
Or they'll seek you out after everyone else has gone.
And this happens all the time, especially when I'm out in the workforce, as you are, or out in the workplace. I constantly get cornered. It's kind of like the doctor at the cocktail party. Well, you know, my arm hurts, but, you know, I'm dealing with right, but I'm dealing with caregiving, and what do I do? And I stop, but you have to understand there's no instantaneous answer. Right. It's a solution that builds once you understand what it is that caregiving truly entails besides the tough stuff. And I'll just repeat one of my mantras, Paul, and I know it's yours. 15% of caregiving is clinical. You certainly have to understand the disease and bedpan patrol, but 85% of caregiving is practical problem solving and figuring out how you're going to deal with the system, how you're going to deal with stuff, family dynamics, financial issues, all kinds of things that you never realized mix into the equation and make every caregiving situation kind of unique, a fingerprint.
And make those decisions at a time of high stress, and in many cases, times when traveling back home is a couple of days ahead.
Right. And, you know, we've talked about it in the past when we've talked about rural areas where people, even to get to the drugstore, are an hour in the car each way, and if it snows, you don't get your prescription. Just to touch back on Steve Zaret, Dr. Zaret, the APA, the American Psychological Association, asked him, how common is it for individuals who become caregivers of family members to have specific training or guidance? What would the kind of training entail? Is it available, and where would one get it? And his answer was, few caregivers get training and guidance when they transition into the role. Most never receive any training at all over the entire course of caregiving. The most likely sources are support groups, something that Caregiver Reality, Paul, and myself do constantly through the Alzheimer's Association or other community groups, as well as state and local area agencies on aging. Unfortunately, not enough. And what he also said, because this was obviously the American Psychological Association, clinical psychologists do not have sufficient training in these areas and issues. And that's not to say that they're not great at what they do, but I think one of the things we have to remember at all times is that caregiving isn't a disease, so we can't cure it. What we have to do is educate people as to how they deal with the system, what it is they have in front of them, have a plan. One of the things in my book on caregiving, the practical issues of caregiving, is how to figure out what you need in that plan and how to do the plan. simple. And anybody that would like it, I mean, it's available out there on Kindle. All you have to do is put in the words David Levy Caregiving on Kindle, and the book will pop up. And I think you'll appreciate the fact that for I forget $7.95, $8.95, it could be some of the most helpful information that you will find, because it's built on 27 years of doing nothing but focusing on the caregiver.
I'd like to invite our listeners who are either employers or employees to write into me at paul@caregiverreality.com and tell us a little bit about the training that either you give or you have received at the workplace, because you're the boots on the ground. That's how we learn. And we would love to share some of these on air as we receive them. Again, Paul,
and we can do it anonymously.
Yeah, absolutely anonymously. No names or references to employers. Paul@caregiverreality.com, and I look forward to receiving them.
Right. And remember, you can call us at 1-888-565-1470. You're listening to us on WWNN 1470 AM, iHeartRadio, and caregiverreality.com, and it's posted everywhere.
Right.
So if you're listening now, you've heard it, but it gets out to the world over the next 5 to 7 days. And if you go to our .com website, we archive for you the last dozen shows, so that if you missed something or you want to go back and hear it again, this show will be posted by tomorrow, but the last 3 months are all on there as well. Every week, as you know, we are the kind of the caregiving arm for medical research charities. I bring it up constantly, and I then pick one of their constituent organizations. Scripps, we know, is dealing extensively with Alzheimer's, but one of their other organizations is the National Brain Tumor Association, and since this is Alzheimer's and brain disease, I just thought I would give them a shout out. And the National Brain Tumor Society is fiercely committed to finding better treatments and ultimately a cure for people living with a brain tumor today and anyone who'll be diagnosed tomorrow. This means affecting change in the system at all levels, and they go on to say, we have rigorously and thoughtfully built our new agenda, integrating research and public policy to bridge critical gaps, starting with discovery science to clinical trial design and the development of new therapies. There are many opportunities to make improvements and speed the momentum of new findings. It's time to build on progress and transform tomorrow. And I think that applies to just about every one of the research organizations under the Medical Research Charities banner. And you can see all of those organizations, and if you like, make a donation or just see what they do, and they're all there at medicalresearchcharities.org, and it's a wonderful organization, and we really feel very affiliated, and they've been very nice to us in allowing us to bring our version of caregiving to their members and their organizations, and it has helped us to grow.
Sure has.
Right. Paul?
I think it's just about that time.
Well, we can go to a break, and one of the things that those of you that are watching us will see on the break is the new digital video from Alzheimer's Association. It is really quite something. If you're in the car, you won't be able to hear it, but when you go home, if you want to take a look at it, it'll be up tomorrow on caregiverreality.com. It's very moving, very accurate, and when we come back, we'll be listening to Dr. Mark Brody tell us more about Alzheimer's and other related brain diseases. So we'll take our break, and we'll see you back here in a minute or two.
Would you like to find a cure for cancer or Alzheimer's, or how about multiple sclerosis?
Caregiving role doesn't get left outside the door. My day is often interrupted dealing with issues at home. That is time not focused on my job. I am but one of the 50 million unpaid family caregivers. Caregiving in the workplace is a costly productivity issue that is only going to increase as our workforce gets older. Caregiver-friendly firms retain hard-to-replace team members, tend to attract better talent, and get out in front of the productivity loss that exists everywhere. Now, new questions are being raised as to possible exposure to discrimination lawsuits as employees question whether their role as a caregiver is damaging them as promotions are denied or reprimands increase that might result in a termination. Caregiving in the workplace, left unaddressed, is costing your firm money, reputation, and possible litigation. Caregiver Reality brings education and training solutions to the workplace. Let our experienced team help evaluate your unique situation. Contact me at paul@caregiverreality.com. That's paul@caregiverreality.com. Do it today.
This is Caregiver Reality with gerontologist David Levy and caregiver expert Paul Vadiato, who ask you to call in and speak with him on the air toll-free at 888-565-1470. That's 888-565-1470 to share a story or important information. Now, back to today's Caregiver Reality Show.
Good evening, South Florida, America, and the world. We're back. We're just waiting right now for Dr. Mark Brody, eminent neurologist and principal investigator for Brain Matters here in South Florida, who's been tremendously innovative and creative in terms of working with Alzheimer's families to try and bring more effective drugs and other forms of treatment to the community that will benefit everybody at large, and I'm just waiting for him to call in. So in the meantime, you already had 90 seconds worth of Paul at the break, but I'm going to let him. He had something that he wanted to tell you that he saw in the newspaper today.
USA Today, David, a couple days back, ran a piece. The staggering number of seniors tap Medicare for potent medications. And the article goes on to talk about the dramatic increase of very potent painkillers, as well as antidepressants and other psychotropical medicines that psychotropic that are being prescribed in record numbers, and that percentage seems to be growing and growing and growing. And we're going to have Dr. Brody on. I'm sure as he speaks about Brain Matters, these medications that seem to be growing in number are going to have an effect.
Well, I am sure they are. It sounds to me a little bit like every ache and pain is being a little bit, overprescribed for, but I'm not the one to say that. I'm not treating them. And but the Oxycontins and the hydrocodones and the rest of it are very, very powerful medications. And some of the things that we've found is that when times get tough, sometimes caregivers will reach for their loved ones painkillers and antidepressants because they need a break as well. And so we may also be creating a whole generation of folks that are at a senior age becoming addicted to these substances.
And we'll be exploring that in the weeks and months to come in greater detail. But the article goes on to say that the figures suggest that 1 in 5 of the nation's 43 million seniors get Medicare prescriptions to take pills like Vicodin or Percocet for their aches and pains. That's a lot of people and a lot of pills.
Right. And, to start reaching for that before you've taken a little ibuprofen or aspirin or some of the traditional things, either we have really developed a nation in a tremendous amount of pain, or our sensitivity and our desire to knock it out and ask for something stronger and stronger I'm not taking anything away from anybody. If you got pain, it hurts. But do we need it at those levels? And it has to do with all forms of medication. You constantly have to ask your doctor, ask the hospital, do I need to keep taking these in the same quantity, in the same dosage, in the same frequency? Because many times we have that doctor visit or a visit to the clinic and it's, hi, how are you, how you feeling, nothing's changed, here's your prescriptions for the next month. And while that's not taking anything away from the patient or the doctor, sometimes you really have to question. And, you know, I've told you, I had to deal with it in my own personal circumstances, both with my father and ultimately with my wife, because they got so used to prescribing. And then the patient gets so used to having. I'm not saying addicted necessarily, but they expect to see those pills. And all of a sudden you get to 10, 11, 12 medications besides what may be over the counter and herbal and this and that, and it becomes chemical soup. You don't even know whether one's canceling out the other, whether you're making a whole new thing, and it's a very dangerous thing when you start having multiple medication, and especially when you're dealing with folks of diminished capacity, where you may be filling their drug box. All of a sudden it's 11 pills, and 3 are for the morning, and 4 for the middle of the afternoon, and 2 are just before dinner, and another 4 are right before we go to bed, and everybody gets confused, all right? And then if you say, Dad, did you take your pill?
Which pill when?
Which pill when, and did he really take it, or did he drop it? I can remember with my dad. He would say, yeah, I took my medication, and I'd go back and take a look under his dresser. The pills had dropped and rolled under there. So, I mean, I knew that while he meant well, he couldn't remember whether he had taken them or not. And that's a word to the wise out there. Don't assume in caregiving that simply because you've communicated and somebody has said, yes, I have. You know, it's the age-old story when you have family out of town and mom or dad are not doing so well, but nobody believes you, and they call up and they go, Mom, how you doing? Fine. Everything okay? Yes. Here, talk to your father. And so when they arrive and they come down to visit for the holidays or whatever, and all of a sudden they see what Dad or another member of the family's been talking about, it's a shock, because we can always come up with a cliche like, okay, I'm fine, it's all right.
Well, the reality is, David, they don't want to ask questions that they really don't want to hear the answers to, because then it puts the ball in their court to help with the solution.
Absolutely.
In way too many cases. Back to my previous life in the world of wealth management, when we were dealing with families where there was illness, and the illness was severe, particularly the dementias and the Alzheimer's, which you've said 100 times is probably one of the more difficult types of caregivers. And mom or dad, who was the caregiver, started to self-medicate, either with alcohol or with medications such as Xanax. When they spoke to the children, and the children say, hey, listen, I got enough worrying about Dad with Alzheimer's. Don't tell me now that Mom's a drug addict also, and I have to deal with that as well. And they go into overload. So in many cases, it's just plain overlooked.
Well, you know, we live in a world where we would like quicker gratification for that which ails us. And, everybody wants a magic bullet. And in some cases we have it. In some cases we've abused it. For the last few years we hear that hospitals and nursing homes have bugs that don't react well to antibiotics. For a long time it was the acronym MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus.
That's a mouthful.
That is a mouthful. Now, and what has happened is we have gotten to the point where the highest drug in the food chain is pretty much something called vancomycin, although there is one just a little bit higher. We're finding now that we have developed a whole group of bugs that don't respond to either vancomycin or the next strongest variety, and we may run out of the fact that we may not have an antibiotic to deal with the bug. And so I think Dr. Brody's on the line. Dr. Brody, you there?
I'm here.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I know you're a very busy person, and I know this is Alzheimer's and Brain Disease Month, and so what I'd like to know from you is, I know you're doing a lot of research. Is there anything that you can tell us that might be informative to our audience about, are we near any breakthroughs, or are you seeing anything on the horizon?
Well, let's see. There's always things on the horizon. Is there some light at the end of the tunnel? Yes. There are some late phase trials, phase 3, that means the last step before you go to the FDA to get approval, that are showing some promise. And for the most part, most of the new investigational drugs are directed at either, two targets, either this beta amyloid, which is an abnormal protein that deposits in the brain that's toxic to the brain, and tau, T-A-U, which is also an abnormal protein, both toxic to the brain and the hallmarks of the disease. So most of the trials now are directed at stopping the bad amyloid from forming or trying to dissolve it, or stopping the bad tau from forming or trying to dissolve it. And so that's where most of the activity is now, but there's a lot of people thinking outside the box, and when we do our next show after the International Alzheimer's meeting in Copenhagen, I may have some more information about what's in the pipeline.
Oh, that'd be great. I know that a year or so ago you were dealing with one of the investigational drugs. It was solanezumab, I believe, if I pronounced it correctly, and I see that it may be getting a second chance at bat, because they're trying to see whether or not, if they can use it on a person that's showing signs, or maybe not even showing signs except clinical, at an earlier age, since we know that diseases like Alzheimer's incubate for quite a while, that maybe we can either slow it down. I don't know that it's at the preventative level. What's your thinking on that?
Well, there is solanezumab is, all the MABs at the end are engineered antibodies to something in particular, and in this case, to part of the bad amyloid. The whole idea is that you use an engineered immune kind of projectile to go, and in a lot of cases it's injected intravenously like chemotherapy, to go through the veins up to the brain and glom onto the bad amyloid, and then use the immune system to dissolve it. So the solanezumab is, they presented to the FDA, and they included a spectrum of people from mild to moderate to bordering on moderately severe. And they didn't win approval, but if you looked at the subgroup, this population who were mild, they did have a statistical significant benefit, and the FDA said, if you can go back and show that for the mild group with more people and reproduce these same results, based on what we see, you would get approval. So now we're doing phase 3 with the same solanezumab for people who have mild disease, and that's just started. So we're hoping, that could be a positive study. Solanezumab is also being used for the A4 study, which means preclinical, people who are at high risk but don't have any symptoms. And that study is just starting.
Let me ask you this. One of the things, because I've known you for a while, is your great line was, you can't do human testing without humans. How do you go about finding folks in those early, or let's call it the preclinical stages, to raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm willing to go into this trial because I'm genetically or familially or whatever it may be, possibly a high risk or predisposed. How do you go about recruiting them?
Right. Well, this is you kind of have to preach to the choir. And the idea is that the most motivated group would be adult children of Alzheimer's patients, which would be, by definition, people who have increased risk because they have a first-degree relative with the disease. They will have seen the beast in front of them, so they know what the disease looks like in their parents and really the kind of devastation that happens with the disease. So that would give them the motivation to think about participating in this kind of trial. But this was about over 3-year discussion with the FDA, because what we're proposing is to identify a high-risk group that we say is at high risk, but we don't know definitively that they're going to get Alzheimer's. And then we're going to treat them with, we think is one of our best bets, with an investigational drug that we don't know for sure works and that can have serious side effects. So that was a prolonged, detailed discussion. But what drove this forward was we're way behind the 8 ball. So if the amyloid and tau are forming the bad proteins 10 to 15 years before anybody gets a symptom, then when you see a symptom, you're way behind the curve here. So you got to start earlier. So everybody says, even though we can't be definitive about these things, if people who are willing, especially people who have had direct contact with the loved ones, are willing to participate and if they're identified as a high-risk individual, that they're willing to come in a study, that's where we want to go.
Okay.
So that's how things came about.
All right, and I know Paul has a question, but before we go, and I'm not cutting you off because I've got a bunch more questions to ask, but if somebody wants to get in touch with Brain Matters and you because they have experienced it in their families and they are concerned about it, how do they go about, what's the process besides calling you and making an appointment? What do they have to go through?
Well, to begin with, they just have to call and make an appointment. And actually, we'll get some information over the phone because we're gathering a database. So we're going to have to hone in and get more information to decide whether, it's that you're a person that we would want to think about getting involved in the preclinical or preventive trials. There's a number of people who are, companies that are looking at both prevention and preclinical disease. So what we do is get some information. Do you have any symptoms? Who was it? Your mother, your father? Data. How young or what age did they have onset of disease? Did they have a true diagnosis of Alzheimer's, or you know what the diagnosis was? Sometimes it's kind of dementia, and they don't know a specific diagnosis. So to begin with, it's just get some information. And then from there, decide whether at that point it's worth coming in and having a more formal discussion about what is on the horizon and what people may want to participate in and what would be involved.
Okay. Paul, did you have a question?
Hi, Dr. Brody. This is Paul. Good speaking with you again. Dr. Brody, the correlations between family members that have some sort of cognitive impairment and the likelihood of you or a loved one coming down with similar type of disease. I mean, any idea as to what those ratios are? And I know a lot of people are very frightened who are listening to us that might be a possibility. What would you say to them?
Well, listen, I think, it's hard without, nobody wants to create panic, right? But statistically, if you have a first-degree relative who has Alzheimer's, you're at a statistic 40% increased risk versus the general population. Then if you start looking at specific genes, the ApoE4 gene and the TOM40, there's a number of them now, but there's a couple on the top hit parade. And if we could say, now that we have new techniques to actually non-invasively look to see if amyloid is already accumulating in the brain with special PET scans, or if the abnormal proteins are leaching into the spinal fluid with spinal fluid analysis, we can try to come up with who, based on what we're seeing and all these other tests, who we classify as high risk.
Is there an issue, Dr. Brody, whether it comes down on a gender basis, if your grandmother, your aunt, and your mom, and you're a daughter, versus grandpa, father, and son? Do you see a gender distinction in the genetic pathway?
Yeah, there's slightly increased risk if it was an offspring and their mother had the disease, maternal.
Right.
And we think that may be because that involves mitochondrial function of cells that are predominantly passed down from the female side. So there is statistically an increased risk if it was your mother who had the disease.
All right. And is it
independent of whether you're the daughter or the son?
Okay. So that if mom had it, there is a potential statistical significance, and that may be a warning to you to try and understand better what your risk factors are.
Well, one of the things that I'm a stroke neurologist by training, so one of the things that I saw initially was there were so many people with what we call multi-infarct dementia, vascular dementia, which is kind of the third most common type of dementia. In fact, it turns out that we're not going to be using the word dementia anymore. We've changed it to a neurocognitive degeneration. But that aside, really what I was interested in was prevention, and I wrote a book called The Prevention of Aging, Alzheimer's, and Stroke. And so I think what people want to know is, what is my risk? And what I'm getting at is, just because your mother had Alzheimer's doesn't mean you're destined to have Alzheimer's. You just have a statistical increased risk. Now, there are a few types of rare Alzheimer's, about 5%, that are autosomal dominant. So 25% of those people are going to get the disease. And they're in small groups of people. There's 5,000 people in the country of Colombia. Mm-hmm. And those people get the disease in their late 20s, early 30s, and most of them are dead by 50. And there's a cooperative, or a tent city there, a cooperative effort with the country of Colombia, the NIH, and the Banner Institute in Arizona to use a drug, identify people early, they have MRIs and PET imaging down there, and then treat them before they have symptoms, because that is the human model with a human. People are destined to get the disease.
Dr. Brody, when you deal with a group, and I'm aware of the 5,000 in Colombia, that extended family that appears to, be unfortunately impacted with it, when you find something, is there something so unique about their form of Alzheimer's? Is it something that what you learn from it that's transformable or utilizable rather in some of the, in the ApoE4 variety, or what we might call the typical Alzheimer's, because they sound like it's atypical there.
Yeah, they have. This is what we call an amyloidopathy, where these people have a genetic drive to actually form abnormal amyloid. So it's not a question of aging. It's a question of there's a problem with genetic expression of amyloid metabolism. So, and there's three types of it. pre-Smiths 1, 2, and I think, the terms get a little confusing. But the point is, the utility is, if in those people, amyloid is forming, and they're destined to make more, and they're destined to get worse and die at an early age, if you can give them an anti-amyloid drug and show that it works, then that's really kind of a breakthrough. Say, we know that we can actually clear amyloid as it's being formed, and these people aren't dying. They're not meeting their, their fate that they don't really have any escape from. Now, that data is going to be published in 2015, so we're all waiting, because if we can't make a dent there, then we're all going to be kind of discouraged. And somebody say, well, that's a different disease than older people who have Alzheimer's.
But it's really because you're focused on the amyloid, irrespective of whether you're predisposed to create more of it or you're getting it in what I'll call the usual kind of Alzheimer's. It's still a question of knocking down the beta amyloid.
Yeah, well, but the problem is, so far, despite best efforts, we've never proven that clearing amyloid, doing something to amyloid, has changed clinical outcome. We'd like to say that, but we haven't proven it. And so that's a case where you got an accelerated form, and it's very compact, special circumstances, and you sure like to be able to say, we could see it forming, we treated people early, and they have this genetic disease, and we modified it. That would be like a very reassuring.
Yes, it would be. Paul?
Dr. Brody, our listening audience is worldwide at this point. For those families that are taking a loved one for the first time to a neurologist, what type of questions should they be asking their neurologist?
Well, for the first time, I think the first thing that they want to find out is, does whoever their loved one is really have a memory problem that is fixable? I mean, because not all memory problems mean Alzheimer's. So you want to go to somebody who wants to do a comprehensive workup and kind of like a Bogart movie, round up all the usual suspects, put a diagnosis as they can, as accurate, and in stages, because you want to eliminate all the things that are fixable. Sometimes people have depression, sometimes they have medication that interferes with memory and cognition, sometimes they have normal pressure hydrocephalus, structural issues that can oftentimes be fixed. Nobody wants to miss anything that's fixable, so nobody should give somebody a diagnosis of probable Alzheimer's type dementia unless they go to somebody who, preferably does this for a living, as far as, has some dementia expertise, and goes through a workup.
Okay.
But the change is, as you go through this process, we become much better at making a diagnosis without obviously having to do a brain biopsy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the amyloid PET scan or analyzing spinal fluid. Those two things have moved us up a notch significantly to in the order of 90 to 95% accuracy compared to autopsy, which is pretty huge.
Go ahead.
So that's a big step. So I think the first thing you want to do is go in, when you bring your loved one, the first thing you want to do is you want somebody who has a mindset to say, is there a memory problem worth looking into? And start with, let's find out what it is and what it isn't.
Okay.
Because part of the problem is sometimes when people go to primary care physicians, they'll go in and say, Doc, I have some trouble with my memory, and they say, well, you're 86. What do you expect? Or write out a prescription for Aricept and say, try this.
Yep.
And then, the first time they have a discussion with anybody is when they ask the pharmacist what that Aricept is for. And in fairness, a lot of people think, well, I mean, what's the point? There's nothing to do anyway, right? Well, but that's changed. There are things to do, and it's time that we really want to get people who are really truly have the disease and into clinical research studies to see what works.
All right, Dr. Brody, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We only have about a minute or so left, and I want you to be a little self-serving. If somebody wants to get a hold of you, how do they do it? And also, I understand you're moving your offices in Delray from Atlantic Avenue up to Congress, but how does somebody get a hold of you?
Right. Well, they can call us. Through their still phones, and it's 561-374-8461, or they can go on the web, and it's brainmattersresearch.com.
Okay.
And those are the two easiest ways. And I think people they just want some information. So we're more than happy to kind of tell you what we're doing and what's going on out there, and they want to know what's going on around the country, and to that end, you can go on the web and look up under clinicaltrials.gov and look under Alzheimer's, and it'll have all the research that's going on in Alzheimer's in the country.
Dr. Brody, thank you. We're down to our last 30 seconds. I think you said that was 574-8461?
374-8461.
All right, that's my dementia. But thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing from you after you're back from Denmark. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. Bye then.
All right. And America, South Florida, and the world, this has been another session of the Caregiver Reality Hour, and so we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. And Paul?
Good night, everyone. Caregivers, take care of yourselves.
Thanks for joining us for this week's Caregiver Reality Show. Each week, David Levy, a gerontologist, and Paul Vadiato, a caregiver expert with a combined over 25 years of experience, providing practical and realistic help to caregivers struggling to keep up with the needs of a loved one who are unable to care for himself or herself. To reach David Levy, email him at david@caregiverreality.com, or to reach Paul Vadiato, email paul@caregiverreality.com. And find out more online. Just go to caregiverreality.com. See you next week for another exciting show of Caregiver Reality. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management,